Hello and welcome to the China Unraveled podcast, your unfiltered source for what's going on inside China and what it means for the world. I'm your host, Jason Scheftel, and I also used to believe the China story we've all been told. But after living, studying, and traveling throughout the country, I now know better. China's past, present, and future are not what they've been made out to be. Over the last year, I've turned what I've learned into a book. While on here, I shed some light on the big issues. Today's episode is about China's ambitions for the international system. For decades, China has been methodically increasing its presence in international organizations. After all this work, Chinese nationals now run more major UN organizations than citizens of any other country. Many people fear China is stealthily taking over global institutions, biding its time, and positioning itself to stage a coup of the international system once the time is right. So what is really going on? Will China naturally slide into leadership of a global system? Is it a threat? And will it be successful? Let's see if China has what it takes to take over the international system or to forge its own. Over the last 40 years, China has been extremely successful at taking advantage of the international system. And by this, I just mean using it to its fullest potential, not in crazy nefarious ways, although there is some of that, but mostly just in rationally exploitative ways. China has been the best at this, better than any other developing country, and definitely better than the US, because the US didn't design the international system to be its own personal development platform. It was playing a very different game. Although 75 years later, it can be hard to discern exactly what the US was trying to do. Just by virtue of reconciling with the US, China got access to world markets through the WTO, access to offshore consumption when it had little of its own. It got access to a stable international monetary system and was able to sell its products everywhere around the world. And this list of benefits really goes on and on. When China finally managed to integrate all of these elements of our globalized world, it was able to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It was able to grow its GDP multiple times over and massively reduce poverty, hunger, illiteracy, and basically every other metric you could name. Do enough of this and it's easy to see how China became the number 2 economy in the world. And once China started climbing from the bottom to the top of this international system, it was wondering whether it should be running the international system and whether it could replace the United States. What country wouldn't want to? Every country on the make wonders if it can rule the world. It's the same as every new tech company in the San Francisco Bay, hedge fund in New York, DJ in Berlin, or media outfit in LA. It's the same as every new influencer or celebrity. Everyone thinks they're going to make it to the top, yet very few ever do. Taking advantage of a global system is much, much easier than trying to run one, let alone trying to build one from scratch. When we imagine China taking over the international system, we make it seem way easier than it is, as if this is just what happens once one national economy grows larger than another. But this is not how it works. Running an international system is extremely difficult, much more difficult than growing an economy within someone else's system. At heart, China's success was possible because the US system made it possible. Once the US let you into the club, basically once you got past the bouncer at the door, all sorts of security benefits and economic benefits came rolling in, along with advice, support, capital, recognition, and other opportunities. This is how the system was designed to work. Yes, China had to do a lot of work on its end, but once inside, it was possible to get away with almost anything, so long as the US never started targeting it. Today, China wants to project an image that a China-led world is destined to happen and is really only a matter of time, that it is a fait accompli and a completely natural result of its coming preeminence. Behind the scenes, though, or at least when it stops drinking its own propaganda Kool-Aid, China knows the reality is very different. China aspires to global hegemony, almost entirely due to state pride and the domestic propaganda benefits that status would bring to the Chinese Communist Party. It is similar to being named the world's largest manufacturer, trading nation, or economy. It is oh so gratifying and validating to be seen as the world's leader, both within your country and around the world. But there's only one problem. No one hands you the crown. To figure out where the world is headed, we have to ask ourselves one very important question. Are international systems common? How about global international systems? Over the last 75 years, we've all grown up with one, so they feel pretty permanent and immortal. But is this truth, or is it just what we are familiar with? Maybe they appear throughout history, and our time is like most. We have to look at the rhythms and patterns of history to see what we can detect beyond just the last few decades. Maybe international systems spawn and disappear over time, rising and falling with different powers. Maybe data scientists have gone in and calculated that they recur in 50 to 100-year cycles. Either way, we've got to know. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels, not knowing what the baseline is, what we can expect, or why now is or is not different from the past. So, how common are these international systems before our era? Well, the answer is very clear. No, international systems are not common. In fact, they are extremely, extremely rare. Here's a shocking truth. America's international system, the one we've all known for all its flaws, it is actually the only real international system that has ever existed, and the only one even close to being called global. International systems are rare because the primary large-scale political system, historically, was the empire. Rather than link separate pieces of the world together, empires carved up chunks of the world and ate them. Before the mid-20th century, human political history was largely a battle of empires. Empires gobbled up their neighbors, fought each other, and broke apart. 500 years ago, the European empires finally took this battle to the seas and made it intercontinental and then global. The winner of that battle royale, the greatest of all the global empires, was the British Empire. It was so large and powerful that it maybe counts as an international system in itself. But that's it. Before World War II, no country had ever presided over a system of formally equal nations, and nowhere close to the almost 200 we have today. And the reality of old organizations like the League of Nations shows why. Countries simply could not overcome their imperial impulses. Our whole idea of an international system is something we take for granted, yet it never existed before the US built it after World War II. What we are doing today is projecting our modern idea of how the world works back onto old historical periods. We look back on the past as if different agreements, treaties, and other events were all prologues, first steps towards the modern, liberal, international system we know today. But that is not the way things looked on the ground, where treaties and agreements and alliances were often paper thin and decades behind the political reality. In the past, Britain and other empires weren't trying to create international systems. They were trying to absorb as much useful land, labor, and capital into their closed imperial system as possible. The exact opposite of the open international system we have today. They used new long-distance ships and then railways to conquer farther than anyone had before, and then used these same navies and railways to ferry valuable goods and resources all over the world. Before the 20th century world wars, what we call the international system was really just a weak set of norms generated by centuries of imperial collisions. Nations spawned when imperial systems fragmented or were created as useful pawns on the global chessboard. For example, Britain helped create the Greek nation-state in the 19th century just to mess with the Ottoman Empire. In this way, Britain built itself a great empire and spawned many nations, but never really ran or created anything we'd consider an international system. Britain is also such a great example because it shows just what was necessary to make that sort of old empire a reality. Britain used its military more widely and liberally than any country before it. As of 2020, only 22 countries in the world have not been invaded by the United Kingdom at some point in their history. For 65 countries, Independence Day means the Day of Independence from Britain. We always forget just how powerful the British Empire really was at its height. Here's a crazy fact. During the 19th century Opium Wars with China, Britain had the option of supporting a major rebellion in the South. Without even trying too hard, really without even breaking a sweat, Britain could have partitioned the most populous country on earth and one of the world's oldest empires. Had it wanted to, a few words and a few maneuvers of its navy would have been enough to split China into two countries, one in the north and one in the south. Great states with this much power rarely went around helping increase the wealth and status of potential rivals or trying to make sure everyone got along. That just wasn't what they were out to do. Or, in other words, normal countries in the past didn't build international systems. What they did was build their own private empires, doing whatever was necessary to support them, and often creating or destroying new nations almost on a whim. History's most powerful empires did sometimes do great, almost charitable goods for the world, such as when the British Empire almost single-handedly ended slavery, a practice that goes back to the earliest periods of the agricultural revolution. But mostly, Britain and other empires just tried to stay at the top of the pack, which was not an easy thing to do. Over 100 years after Britain had the power to chop China up into pieces, but decided not to, it was once more just some islands in the North Atlantic and too weak to even control the Suez Canal. Our world of free independent nations, global treaties, secure international shipping, transnational manufacturing, agricultural and energy supply chains, our entire world of globally interconnected economies, our truly global international system. All of this, is not how the world works. Typically, there have been far fewer independent nations, far less respected and impactful global treaties, and disconnected economies, and insecure global shipping, which limited mass production and consumption outside of imperial networks to local regions. And this whole system, if you can call it that, was bound together with lots of mutual fear, suspicion, and often hatred. For any of this to go away, the normal, brutal competition between nations had to be seriously curbed, which is what the British, for a while, and then the Americans were able to do. And our real question with China is, will it be able to do something similar? Behind everyone's fear of China taking over the current international system or slowly building its own shadow system to eventually replace it with, there is a much deeper and in some ways more rational fear that maybe China will try to take over the world by force, or is at least willing to go down guns blazing if it fails. Bizarre as it sounds, this is probably more likely than China ever leading any functional international system. Again, no country in history besides the US ever has, and for very good reasons. The conditions needed are as rare as the system itself. No country outside of the US ever possessed the combined lack of needs, abundance of means, and overriding strategic purpose that the US possessed after World War II. 21st century China has too many needs, too few means, and a strategic dream it will never be able to fulfill. This becomes clear when we really look at how the US system actually operates. Not only is it unusual, that it exists at all, it is also extremely unusual in how it actually functions. Many people have no idea how or why the US system functions the way it does, or if it functions at all, because there's no real template or precedent for what the US accomplished. Our implicit idea of how countries come to power and what China might be up to is much closer to Britain's earlier imperial model for global empire than what the US did. The US system is a totally different beast. The system has eroded over the decades, and by 2020, it can be hard to see how it actually works, and many people can't believe it ever worked at all. The network of international institutions people associate with the international system, such as the UN, WTO, WHO, and others, are not the meat of the American system. They all serve useful but supportive functions. Most of the time, these international institutions aren't where the real action happens. In fact, during the Cold War, they were often totally paralyzed and used basically to posture and pander. But behind the scenes, and beneath all these more familiar organizations, America built another system, one built on military protection and economic bribes, which is what really binds our world together. The alphabet soup of international organizations and institutions are kind of like the graphical interfaces for computer operating systems. They're there to help make things familiar and easy to navigate, letting us know what to focus on and what to point to when things don't work. Meanwhile, the real action happens below these surface abstractions. After all, creating a pretty, usable interface doesn't mean you have a functioning computer. If just creating international organizations were the answer, our world would be a much less complex and violent place. Deep at the heart of the globe's political operating system sits a unique US decision. Rather than force countries to subordinate their political and economic systems to a US empire, the US decided to do the opposite. Instead of creating a real global empire, the US created a system that gave every country allied with it the luxury of living as if it had its own empire. Rather than materially exploiting or physically colonizing other countries, the US gave these countries access to its own resources and markets, as well as the resources and markets of its vast alliance network. All countries had to do was be on the right side of the Cold War. Compared to the empires of the past, the US was giving rather than taking. It was providing resources to other countries rather than extracting them. And it wasn't just providing resources, but something more fundamental, a platform for development, one even more essential than any computer operating system. While it may feel normal to us, this whole US international system, this platform for peace and prosperity, is weird. It is abnormal. It is basically wrong from the perspective of history. Napoleon, Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, Qin Shi Huangdi, all of history's greatest conquerors would look at our world as bizarre and the US system as totally crazy. Instead of using its military to pummel other countries, the US used it to offer security protection to them. Instead of using its economy to drain the rest of the world, the US used it to rebuild Europe and support the export-driven industrialization of Asia. This was only possible because the US was and remains historically unprecedented, with reservoirs of strength far greater than any of the great empires of the past, from Britain to China. The real reason we have an international system is because the US grew so powerful it could impose terms on the rest of the world. The international system we live in is relatively tolerant and decent because the terms the US laid down were generous. For the first time in centuries, all the world's historic empires and other major powers stopped trying to rip out each other's throats because they could now get the spoils of war without the actual conflict. When American conservatives talk about peace through strength, or how important American strength is to the world, this is a good approximation of what those statements really mean. Part of the reason the world system seems so disjointed today is because our unusual US system was built for a different time. It was built to help win the Cold War. Once that war was over, it all started to rust and then crumble. Feelings of shared human progress are not as motivating as a good old-fashioned nemesis. Lacking any direction, the US kept the system intact even as it was abused at greater and greater scale. The Soviet Union may have been gone, but all the benefits of the US system were still there. That is why countries kept playing the game. That's why China joined the WTO 9 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and why it didn't abandon the US system once trade wars, sanctions, and blacklistings started flying its way. If China could have gotten a better deal on its own or anywhere else, it would have left long ago. For years, countries like China could use the generous global system to maximum effect without any recourse from the US. The US system was actually used to provide cover against US retaliation because back during the Cold War, being on the same team meant abiding by pretty dispassionate norms of fairness. Today, that logic just doesn't apply in the same way, and parts of the US population reasonably feel like US liberality was exploited. And of course, it was, because that was the point. It was part of the strategy for winning the Cold War. Afterwards, the US could have changed the game, but it didn't. It continued to play an outdated one even as the world shifted. For decades, US policy ran on autopilot and continued to support this newly obsolete system. As negative consequences built up, it should come as no surprise that US generosity eventually curdled into outbursts of spite and spectacularly blew up in the establishment's face during the 2016 presidential election. The US is now ambivalent at best about keeping the global economy afloat, but for the system it built to function, the US must keep the benefits flowing. Not only does that look unlikely, it is increasingly looking impossible. Any country that wants to run an international system like the one we've had for the last 75 years has to pay up, and the costs are rising. As for all the other models for running an international system, ones not built off of security guarantees, economic incentives, and inducements, well, none of those really ever succeeded in creating an actual international system in the first place. We are biased towards the present. We always think what has been happening is going to keep happening. But this time, looking too much at the world around us is no help. Our lifetimes are the anomaly. So let's look more towards the past, where the record is pretty clear. A wary US does not seem too keen on replacing its old system anytime soon. As this US system continues to erode, a power vacuum grows, and many countries are eager to fill it. Many of these same countries are the ones who exploited it towards its end when it began to flounder. But if the US doesn't replace its system, the world's going back to where it was before. As the US-sponsored platform for economic development wanes and US military overwatch recedes, regional conflicts will return. Countries seeking to rise to the top will first have to master their own regions. And China has a mean region, one that has always kept it hunkered down in China and easily prevented it from ever taking over the rest of the world. If it isn't filled by the US, our global power vacuum isn't going to be filled by China or by any other single country. It's going to be filled by the void.